Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Welcome to our working session. We're just going to give everyone a minute or two to join and get started. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Yeah, it's great to see so many folks on right at the top of the hour.
I know.
I'll probably get started in just a few minutes after to give additional folks some time to join.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone one more minute in case we have some people who are joining us after the hour. Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started since it seems like people joining has slowed down. My name is Sarah Lee. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I'm going to start by saying this is the first webinar that the Justice Counts team has done, so please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties this morning. This is a new technology for us, but we're rolling with it. I'm joined today by several of my colleagues. Our program director, Katie Moshauer, and a data scientist from our research department, Matt Herman, are going to be leading the discussion on the metrics. Our project manager, Shamika Kelly, is going to be moderating and paying attention to the chat. And our policy analyst, Kiosha Donald, is going to be running slides. So we're all thrilled to be welcoming you here today and hoping that you'll be able to share your expertise with us as we craft the tools for the implementation of the Justice Counts prison metrics. We're going to be using a lot of the different webinar features this morning, including the chat and the polls. I'm just realizing now that I need to allow you all to use the chat. And so to get started, we're going to ask everyone just to test out the chat feature. If you could let us know who is here. So introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to know who you are, what agency or state you're from, just to give us a sense of who's watching this morning. Thank you, Art, for being the first one. Good morning, everyone. Hi, nice to see you all. This is so exciting. We honestly didn't know if anyone would be interested in joining us, so it's so exciting to see so many of you joining in from all across the country. We're going to start the presentation with a bit of an overview of the Justice Counts project to sort of ground the discussion, but then we're very quickly going to get into the nitty-gritty details of the metrics. We'd ask if you have questions for the team that you put them into the Q&A and not in the chat, so we can just keep track of questions that are coming in. And the chat will be more for discussion purposes to start out with. The discussion that we're going to have today is really going to be aimed at the nitty-gritty details of the Justice Counts metrics. If that doesn't seem like it's for you, we understand, but we hope that you'll stay to join the discussion. So let's start things out. Justice Counts is a national initiative led by the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The goal of the project is to make more timely, accurate, and accessible data on safety and justice available to policymakers and to remove the burden on agency staff who are tasked with responding to frequent data requests. This initiative is supported by an unprecedented coalition of partners such as criminal justice associations like the Correctional Leaders Association, organizations representing state and local leaders like the National Governors Association, national research and technical assistance organizations like RAND, and more. And the Justice Counts Coalition is also led by a 27-member national steering committee composed of leaders and innovators across the criminal justice system. Can we go to the next slide, Kiosha? Thank you. So together with BJA and the CSG Justice Center, our partners have helped to design 3 core components of Justice Counts. The first is a set of consensus-driven metrics that we're going to be talking about today. They're aimed at the entire system to help agencies focus on sharing the most critical data that policymakers need to make effective decisions. The second part of Justice Counts is a set of tools that will be used by agencies to publish the metrics. And the third is technical assistance to help agencies effectively and efficiently share data that answer policymakers' most frequently asked questions and better frame the narrative about the work that agencies do. Next slide. So today we're going to be talking about how the metrics will be shared using the tools that we're building. And we want to make sure that we're mindful of agency staff who are going to be tasked with implementing the metrics. And so the feedback that you all provide to us today is going to be incredibly valuable. The Justice Counts metrics were developed by 7 sector-specific subcommittees composed of practitioners and researchers who focused on determining the most useful and feasible metrics for policymakers to consider and for agencies to share. Through a series of votes and detailed prioritization discussions that included feedback from subcommittee members, from partner organizations, and system stakeholders, the Justice Counts Coalition came to a consensus on the first tier of 67 metrics that were released to the public in May of 2022. Agencies will use these Tier 1 metrics to provide timely and important data to public policymakers and decision makers about their work. And the metrics are really feasible for several reasons. The first is that they only require aggregate level data. Therefore, no data sharing agreement is required for agencies to participate in Justice Counts. They also largely reflect data that agencies already collect, but that may not be publicly shared on a regular basis. Therefore, they hopefully should not require new data collection efforts by agencies. And third, the metric definitions, time periods, and sharing frequency all can be adjusted to an agency's needs. So this focus on feasibility was really important when the subcommittees were developing these metrics. Metrics are structured by category, and each category is designed to help policymakers, agency leaders, and the public answer some key questions. So Kiosha, you can keep going through the slides to show what those questions are. These categories and questions were identified and vetted by our National Steering Committee, and they really drove the development of the Tier 1 metrics. And let's go to the next slide to see what those Tier 1 metrics are. So as you can see, they cover all the different categories and different sectors. We'll just pause here to let you all read. I know it's a lot to take in.
And one piece I'll note as everyone's kind of, as Sarah said, taking this in, is that this matrix is set up to allow folks to either view by sector. So for example, prisons is what we're going to focus on today, but you could also look at something like population movements across the entire system. And that's a really big consideration, is helping to get beyond an individual agency or sector view, but getting to the system view. And so we'll be getting into some of those details as we start talking about the metrics, but I think that's a really helpful frame to think about what should be measured across the system and what kind of consistency actually lends to really presenting that view for people.
Thanks, Katie. That's a great point. Let's move to the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about how the metrics are going to be shared by agencies. So Justice Counts is building a digital infrastructure that will be available to all agencies that choose to participate to support them in sharing whichever Justice Counts metrics they can. The infrastructure is designed to be super flexible to meet an agency where they are. So we're going to do a little walkthrough of like what this might look like for an agency. So let's look at the next slide. So this is a mock-up of what an agency dashboard might look like. Through an initial one-time onboarding process, each agency is going to be able to customize the settings for which metrics they will be reporting. Using an interface that will allow users to toggle on and off metrics, agencies are going to select which metrics they will be sharing. So for example, if a law enforcement agency cannot share anything on the calls for service metric, you can see that it's going to be toggled off and they won't have to have anything more to do with that metric unless in some future point they decide they can now share data on that metric. And the idea is that an agency would only go through this configuration process at the start, and then all of the configurations that an agency sets up about the metrics are going to be stored as metadata And that metadata travels with all of the data that an agency shares, which will allow us to see which agencies are more similar or which agencies are really different from each other. We go to the next slide, Keisha. So if a metric is toggled on, there are several further customizations within that metric. Each one has a preferred sharing frequency and a list of breakdowns. And the idea is that an agency will share a number for that top level metric, so that staff level. And then also if they're able to share data points for each of the breakdowns, which are listed in the left with the blue check marks next to them. And the idea would be that all of the data shared for the breakdowns would add up or total to the number for the top level metric. And as you can see, each of the metrics has a definition, each with its own toggles as well. We'll provide our preferred definition, and if an agency can report the data that matches or share the data that matches that definition, then they really don't need to do anything else to customize that definition. But for if some reason an agency's definition doesn't match our preferred definition, there are customizations that, as you can see. So for an agency reporting the staff metric, you can see whether or not they could toggle on this. This metric does, when we're reporting it, it does include all of the things checked yes, but it does not include volunteers or interns. And so if your metric that you're sharing is different, you would be able to toggle on and off to meet your needs. And when you're setting up the overall definition on the right, we're going to assume that that definition carries over to all the breakdowns that are shared on the left side with the blue check marks. Let's go to the last slide. Yep. And so each of those breakdowns also has their own preferred definition with customization options as well. So you can see that every part of the metric is flexible in a way that we hope allows agencies to share the data that they already have, instead of having to start from scratch in order to participate in Justice Counts. I know I just went through a lot of complicated technical stuff, and so I'd like to pause before we dive into the metrics and ask if anyone has any questions.
Yes, we do have a question. Art is asking about whether or not these data points are going to be expanded in the future. Like under public safety, are we going to suggest a category like inmate assaults on staff and inmate assaults on inmates with definition?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Art. Not getting ahead of yourself at all. Happy to have questions as they come up. Dive in, let us know. So these are the tier 1 metrics. And again, Sarah mentioned that there was a dual test for tier 1, which was feasibility and the usability of it. So these are meant to be the foundational layer of metrics that really answer the core questions and really expand knowledge about the criminal justice system. We're currently working on developing tier 2, which is where we'll be able to consider some of those more detailed questions like the one that you were just asking. And that will allow us to get into more nuanced and expanded metrics. So that process is starting right now. There will be a public comment on those tier 2 metrics early in 2023. I encourage everyone who would like to be involved in that process to sign up for the Justice Counts mailing list to stay involved and to be notified about the public comment so that you can actually contribute to prioritizing the metrics that you think are the most important. All right, Sarah, you want to pick things up?
Yeah, I don't think I see any other questions coming in about the digital infrastructure. Oh, I do see one more. Let's see. If we're currently using a software system to capture similar data across our community justice programs, does your platform have the ability to integrate? So that is a great question. That is definitely something that we are planning and working on. There's going to be several different ways for agencies to share data through the infrastructure. For the agencies that don't have a current software or don't have the capability, there'll be, like manual data entry. We're also going to be working on some sort of standardized ways for agencies to export their data through their system into an Excel or a CSV file or something like that to upload. And then we're hoping eventually to also have integrations with softwares like case management systems or things like that that would allow through an API for them to talk directly to the Justice Counts digital infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's something that will help to determine with each agency, depending on where they are and where their efficiencies lie. So part of the onboarding process, as Sarah mentioned, is really defining the metric as is appropriate for your agency. And then it will also be in designing a sharing strategy that really reduces the workload as much as possible and automates as much as we can at this stage, so that it's working with the systems you have to automatically send as much data as we can into the infrastructure. Yes, and so there's also a question if we could post a link to the email sign up. So one of our team members will post that to the chat. We'll post it a few times for folks who have joined later, and we'll also have a slide at the end as well of the presentation today for that.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much. If you have questions throughout, please do put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm going to turn things over to Matt and Katie to start getting into some of the more detailed discussion, as we said, of the metrics. And we hope that you'll stick around if you can to really help us work through some of our questions.
Thanks, Sarah. So we wanted to start with one overarching question, and then we're going to go metric by metric for a few of them. So Matt is going to get into this first piece.
Sure. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Sarah. So like Katie and Sarah said, this is one of the questions that we've sort of been wrestling with a little bit internally and thinking through about how you actually talk about admissions or population or releases. When we think about this, there are sort of two major ways that you might report or count the number of people in your prison. You could count the number of people in custody, like physically in beds. That might be one, and the other one might be the people that are under your jurisdiction. So this could include people that are under the jurisdiction of your Department of Correction, but are temporarily held in a local jail or in a private facility or in another state's facility. So when you think about this high level question, like what is the count? What are the numbers that we should use here? For you and your agency, which of these, the sort of custody, the number of beds that are filled, or the number of people under your jurisdiction, which sort of makes sense to you the most and is generally how you all report the data? And Sarah, I think, just put up a poll here. And so I'd love to see some response. And if everyone is in one camp, that's great. And if not, we'd love to sort of have a little bit more conversation if there's a little bit more disagreement or differences between you all.
Well, let's see. I'm seeing a third of people have voted so far. We're seeing option B being a favorite, but still a lot of votes happening. Okay, looks like people are done voting, and I will share the results so we can all see.
All right, let's see. So about a quarter said only people in the physical custody, like meaning in a bed. 73% all people within your system's jurisdiction, and a couple not sure. So I think that that's interesting, and that is the way that we are currently planning to go, because we do recognize that anyone that is in the jurisdiction, under your jurisdiction of a Department of Correction, you have responsibility for.
Mm-hmm.
You have, in some way are sort of supporting them, or in some way the funding is required to either pay for contracts in a local bed. I do think that this is an interesting question, and I think as we continue on and we get into the other metrics, I think it's a good thing to think about here, because one thing that I'll say when we consider this is that a lot of these metrics one of the purposes is for policymakers and for the public and for people to understand them. And we want them to be easily understood. And so when we think about the difference between someone in your physical custody and in a bed in your facility versus under your jurisdiction, I think that's an important consideration when we talk about admissions and when we talk about releases and when we talk about population.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question, and this is where we'd like to use the chat a little bit as well, for those of you who voted or suggested that you would prefer to see just those in your physical custody, I would be curious to hear from you in the chat. Is that a preference, or would you only be able to share that particular metric and not your entire jurisdiction? We just wanted to get a little bit of a sense of what's capacity versus preference in terms of data sharing or what kind of query you could run. There was a great point as well in the chat about being able to make the distinction between those two groups. And that's something that we'll definitely start to talk about as we talk about the overarching metric and then the breakdowns. And if, we're actually making sure that you can have the transparency and visibility into those distinctions that you would prefer. And thanks for those of you who are commenting on preference versus requirements. All right, let's go ahead and dive into the metrics next. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so Sarah kind of walked through a prototype of the digital infrastructure. And for the next bit, I really want you to think about the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen as really displaying different kinds of information. So this big, bold blue text at the top, that's the metric, which is admissions. And this numerical list of blue text at the bottom, those are optional breakdowns. So an agency could select, I would like to share data on admissions, and that's the end of the story. That's all they would like to share on that. Or they could also select to opt into these additional breakdowns of those admissions by person offenses, property offenses, et cetera. We're also going to talk about kind of like the data elements that can go into that, or the kind of customizations that can be turned on and off. And those will all be on the right side of the screen as we're currently showing. And everything on the right side of the screen in these tables, these are not, individual numbers that would be shared. This is just a description. Think of it almost like a recipe of what goes in to admissions. When I say admissions, it includes these things or it does not include these things. And we've just given the little yes, no toggles here as an example that every single one of these, you would have the option to go in and say, yes, that feels right. No, that's not how we do things. Probationers don't come into our prison system, so I'm going to toggle that off. But yes, parole revocations come into our prison system and would be counted as admissions. So our goal here is to make this as flexible as possible so that every agency can be accurately reflected in what they consider to be an admission to their system. So first, we wanted to ask a general question about the admissions breakdowns. And Sarah, I think you have a poll for this as well, right? So we wanted to see on the admissions, does it feel like those breakdowns are feasible or something that your agency would be able to share and opt into? Just wanted to kind of get a quick litmus test if we're hitting the mark on those. All right, Sarah, how are we doing on response?
We got about 40% of people participating so far. Just gonna give it another few seconds.
Mm-hmm. And we've got some great questions coming in on kind of what counts under jurisdiction and does a new sentence mean in any state or simply in the state that I am in? And so we'll get to those after this poll closes.
All right. Yeah. Let's see any new votes coming in. Here we go.
Okay. Great. I love over 50% yes. That makes me happy. Totally fine if not sure is there. And again, these are all optional. So Sarah showed you the toggles where agencies can opt into the level of disaggregation they would like to participate in. So again, flexibility is the name of the game for systems that already have a query that shows these kinds of things. It could be very easy to just upload that data. And for others, it might be a stretch goal down the line. They might decide to opt into those. So great to see that this feels like something that a lot of folks could do, if maybe not everyone. So to the folks who had some questions here, does new prison sentence mean in any state? So some of the kind of includes and excludes here, I believe are there folks from other states in your facilities? But these are some things that we could definitely add or create additional distinctions about a new prison sentence from my state or a new sentence from, an external state is an additional layer that we could add, which is exactly the kind of thing that we're interested in hearing from you about what else should this list include? And so that's the next question that we wanted to pose to you of in the list that's in this table, this blue table right now, would this list allow you to adequately define what you mean as an admission or not? Or are there things that you feel are missing? So that's the next poll we wanted to do to just get a little bit of a litmus test on, does this feel like it's right? Or if not, we'll ask you to add some things to the chat that would make this list more complete for you and actually more accurately reflect your data. All right, Sarah, how are we doing on the poll?
Got about 40%.
All right, 40% of you are very active voters, and I like it. And I'm going to read some of the great insights in the comments here while folks are voting.
And the other thing that I just want to point out here is we create this list to sort of allow the agency to customize that first question we talked about. Like, is this a custody measure or is this a population measure? So you could see sort of most 3/4 of the way down the list, we have a toggle on and off for admissions to private prisons, or we have admissions to facilities in other states. So if your agency is going to share data related to those sort of that custody measure, you might turn those off. And if you're sharing them based on the jurisdiction measure, you might turn them on. And that is sort of the operation by which you would configure the specific definition of your data that you're going to share that's related to admissions with justice counts.
Yeah, and there are some great comments coming in here as well. And I realized I just closed the poll. Sarah, could you share out the results again since I preemptively shut that down?
Well, we have like 61% saying yes, 12% saying no, 27% saying I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, there are already some great suggestions, but for those of you that felt like this wasn't a complete list, I'd love to have you continue to put your insights into the chat. Some folks are saying there's a pre-trial element that feels missing. That would be important for their agencies, and that's a great note that we can really think about. Others are mentioning that there's a bit of a lag time to really know who's who and where. And that's something that we're really working with our first agencies and states about, like, when should folks share information? If this is a monthly, count, when should that data actually be asked for? Because we know that there's a lag and sometimes it takes a little while for numbers to sift and settle. And that's something that we're really looking to agencies to help us define because you all know how your data works best. The other piece is that as this is all about configuration today, but the digital infrastructure is also set up so that you can amend a previous report. So if there is a big shift in your numbers between when you originally shared them and when they finally settle, you could go back and update those or override your previous entry to make sure that it continues to reflect accuracy for you. So again, that's part of the flexibility we're really thinking about.
Seeing a question in the Q&A asking, are admissions breakdowns in a hierarchy, or could an admission be in more than one offense category?
That's a great question. I think we have been thinking about it as a controlling offense. Like, ideally, everyone is counted once by the offense that's the most severe, but that's a piece of context that, every agency is going to need to be able to say, we actually think it's this, that, or the other that is more or less significant or severe, so that, we understand how your agency creates a hierarchy. But let's go to the next slide because this actually gets into it. Actually, 1 second before we move on, can we go back, Kiosha? I got ahead of myself. I'll say that this definition here on the right is going to apply to all of the breakdowns. So whatever you select and configure for admissions will apply to how you actually share out person offenses. So you don't have to enter it for everything. It's an overarching piece that will kind of go and yes, you're right. Some are not mutually exclusive. Totally see that in the category. So now we can go to the next one. Just know that this is applied to everyone. So part of what we've done for like person offenses, for example, is to simply list out, here are the common categories of person offenses. We know that each of you have breakdowns within these. We're trying to kind of group offenses. However, some, as one of our commenters mentioned, are not mutually exclusive. Some of the early testing we did on these lists, we heard that arson, for example, could be either a person offense or a property offense in some jurisdictions. And so we put it into both lists so that agencies could turn on or off those pieces as is appropriate and how they might determine things. And again, how you categorize your hierarchy is something that we'd want to make sure is of record as well, so that you can count folks as you already do and reflect it in this. Again, on the right, this is not ever going to be a disaggregation that's asked for. It's the recipe for what goes into the category. So looking to, this particular set of includes and excludes, as we often call them, those toggle customizations, does this feel like the list of person-based offenses would adequately allow you to represent how you define that for your agency? So Sarah's going to put up another poll, and you'll have an opportunity to either help share out where some of those overlaps may be or what might be missing here from the list.
We have a question coming in about domestic violence as well. It's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a great one to be added to the list.
All right, we're getting close to 50%.
Definitely seeing some pieces about that. Can these be mutually exclusive, or are they considered to be in states? And that's a piece too, where if this is not a disaggregation that works for you because these are not actually separated out in your jurisdiction, you could simply just share the admissions metric and not do these breakdowns because they're not appropriate for your area. And that's something that we do recognize, and we don't think that's a bad thing that this would not be data that you would share, but it's just not the way that your state organizes or thinks about data. However, if you have a suggestion for ways that these could be more mutually exclusive as categories, I'd be really interested to hear that as well. And so we have a question that says, can you show a metric on existing data? I'm not quite sure, Gwendolyn, that I totally follow that. Could you add a little bit more into the Q&A for us so I can try to get to the root of that? Thank you. All right, so we're missing some critical things. We heard domestic violence. I would love for folks to put in the chat, what else are we missing? Or what else should we be recategorizing to be more discrete than it currently is? I'd love to hear some thinking on this because this is really just a start and you all have a lot of detail you can add. I'm going to assume that everyone is typing furiously. So I'm going to wait a second for the suggestions in the chat before we kind of skip to the next. All right, I will say, if you want a moment to think about it, we'll have our email up on the screen as well. But you are also welcome to email suggestions. I'll put our email in here now, and again, we'll come back to it. But you're welcome to continue to email suggestions after the fact that come to mind, because we know sometimes on the spot it's a little hard, but definitely want to give you an opportunity to follow up as well.
Yeah, and Katie, I just wanted to, Carl put a good sort of question or comment into the chat. He says, we would need extremely clear statute definitions to align with state regulations. For example, human trafficking versus child engagement can be blurry.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so this is something that we've talked about a lot and thought through. And I think where we've landed currently as a team is that we think it would be impossible to create 51 versions of this that would exactly align with all the statutes of every state. So in order to be most flexible, we sort of have tried our best to create these overarching categories of, okay, most states have a concept of person or violent offense or a concept of a property offense. And with our customizations here, these categories, what we're sort of toggling on or off, we're getting a little bit more in depth, but we can't possibly cover all the specific details of every state.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we're aiming to do really is allow states to align as close as they can here without sort of being incredibly prescriptive, which would make it hard for more folks to participate. So that's sort of the line that we're trying to walk here. And like as like a sort of in the weeds data nerd, that makes me uncomfortable. And maybe we're hearing some of that from you folks, and that's totally understandable. But I think that's sort of the line we're trying to toggle have here. And we, especially in the context that Sarah set up at the beginning of this sort of feasibility context, because we want as many agencies and we want as many states to be able to participate in tier one. And so not having very, very specific in the weeds definitions, we hope will allow as many as possible to participate.
Right. And Matt, what I'm seeing in some of these comments as well, I'm just going to kind of articulate the difference between the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen. So all of the elements in the table are a description. They would not be individual numbers you would actually be sharing. So that's kind of where some of the distinctions between these becomes a little bit less important. It's more of, does your definition of a person offense include something like human trafficking? And if it's yes, you would need to actually say it includes 42 of those particular offenses. It would simply say that like person offenses includes these types of offenses for our state or our agency. So again, the only number that would be reported is person offenses and a total aggregate number. And everything on the right side in that table is really about what is included or not included in that number. So that takes a little bit of the stress out of what does that category mean. It's meant to be an indicator more than a precise measurement. And there's some great questions coming up about if everyone submits their own definition, how does the data help if shared? And that's a great question, and we've definitely heard it a lot. So one of the things that we really thought about in this project was what has worked really well in big data efforts and what has not worked as well in big data efforts that have come before us. We're not the first, and we absolutely know that. And one of them is that when you get into like a national standard for data, it has less utility for local decision makers because it isn't actually specific to their locality. It becomes a generality rather than a specific. We also know that agencies needing to conform to something makes it much harder for them to participate. So we want to make sure that the data is first and foremost useful at the local level or the state level. And that as we get up to the national picture of data, we'll be able to say what agencies are like one another based on all of the detail that is included in onboarding. So we'll be able to say that maybe, Iowa DOC is actually a lot like Washington DOC based on the way that they've categorized their data. And so we can consider cohorts that actually have really similar definitions rather than using an overarching generality. So it is a little bit different than a data standard, but we wanted to allow as much flexibility for agencies to kind of show up where they're at and how they actually use data today. So that's a little bit of how we see the data being the most functional in this project. And it is a little bit different than how some other projects have worked.
Well, and to add to that, Katie, I think our plan is to have some suggested or preferred definitions that are pre-configured. So if your agency is sort of able to share data that aligns with these definitions, we would love that, but we have the flexibility for the customization. And David asked a question, and a couple people have mentioned UCR or FBI reporting. And so each of these categories comes from the UCR and NIBR's definition. So we've tried to align them as close as possible. And so, yeah, that's sort of to answer the question, that is where the lists of what is included in these person offenses do come from, those UCR FBI standards.
Mm-hmm. And there are some great questions in here that are suggestions. So what we are going to be doing is taking note of all the comments and the questions and then doing some reconfiguration after this. So we won't be getting to all of these, especially the ones that feel a little bit more like suggestions rather than discussion points. But I really appreciate some of the pieces that are coming in about does person mean violent offense, et cetera. Those are really great things to be thinking about. And I'm seeing a great question here about, it would be interesting to know upon arrest if individuals are experiencing a mental health episode. And those are definitely metrics that are being considered as part of tier 2. And there will be one of these kind of very detailed conversations for each of those sectors, including law enforcement, where I think we'll get some really great suggestions around that front as well. Well, I know it's about 9:40, so why don't we jump to a couple slides forward to another one of our metrics. Do you want to talk about daily population, Matt?
Sure, yeah. So this is another metric that we sort of covered in part by our initial conversation around custody, or the custody versus jurisdiction piece. But I do think there are some really interesting pieces in the customization on the next slide. So at a high level, we're looking for the number of people who are incarcerated under the jurisdiction of your agency. And this metric is going to be a point in time count. And so we're looking for the last day of the calendar month, if that's something that you're able to share with us. But there are a couple pieces here when we thought through, okay, how do we define this count of the people who are incarcerated under the jurisdiction of your agency? And the list that we have on the slide here are sort of all of our possible customizations. So we'd love to, again, to think through, does this list capture incomplete, as complete as possible, how you would actually be able to define population for your agency? So does this cover it? Are things missing, or are you not sure? So we'll give you a second, and if you're thinking things are missing from this list, we would love to hear what are those elements that we should include in this list that you can either toggle on or off that would more accurately reflect the way that your agency counts or considers daily population. How are our votes looking, Sarah?
Yeah, we've got about 36% of people, so we would love to see a few more votes. Get out those clickers.
Yeah. And the other thing I will say here, also love any feedback in the chat here. Initially, we had conceptualized this as an average daily population metric, but that some agencies report. We did hear in conversations with folks around the country that for some agencies or departments, that is a little bit more challenging to calculate an average daily population. So right now, what we ended up here is a point in time count. So if any thoughts on that in the chat, we could also bring that up here.
All right.
One piece.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying one piece we didn't mention for any of the metrics is that each of them will include an other field so that you can say there's an important element that isn't in your list, even once we kind of add in all of your suggestions. And you could describe it, because we know that this is a new project, and so we're going to need to evolve, and especially as we see multiple agencies adding the same things into the other categories, we can start to incorporate that. So there will be an ability, if you don't see something in the list, the other category will always be there for you to be able to customize even further. Okay, small group of no's for this vote, so that feels pretty good. I do like some things I'm seeing in the chat about, can an agency actually provide a list that says kind of what these categories mean to them? I think that's a really exciting idea we can consider. Yeah, keep the ideas coming. This is really, really helpful for us. All right, so I know we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got a couple different metrics that we could talk about. And so how about we go ahead and jump to releases? I think we've had a couple of questions about releases in the Q&A. And that's a helpful question. Art, thank you for the clarification there. I realize under funding, we have some pieces around, contract beds in local jails and those pieces, but we don't have them under population. So that could be an interesting thing for us to think about too, about how we could incorporate those kinds of distinctions about where people actually are in your custody. For releases, this is one where we started to move away from that kind of cross-system view of offense type and to really think about, what happens when someone leaves your facilities. So I think the first question we'd like to ask again is, for these numerical, list at the bottom, do these feel feasible and like the right way to be thinking about releases from your agency? And Sarah, I think you've got a poll for that one. And while folks are thinking, there's a great question about, who is really included in terms of age. We're really thinking about the adult system. So, I think the age is more of if that person is considered part of the adult criminal justice system in your state, that would be a person to count. Laura here has mentioned that, in her state, an adult can be as young as 14. That might actually be something, we know jurisdiction is something we'll ask agencies to define as part of onboarding, less critical for departments of corrections that are commonly statewide, but for like a law enforcement agency, really being able to get specific about their jurisdiction is very important. And so something like the age of your adult system might be something of like overall context that we can also think about how do we include that as part of the onboarding so that we again have a way to understand who that system actually entails for your state.
Last call if anyone else wants to vote in the poll. Oh, okay.
All right, so 8% of folks felt like this wasn't quite either the right thing or something that felt feasible. I'd love for those folks to be able to just kind of give us some suggestions on what might be more amenable or more helpful for your agencies. And there's a great question here about, are these release events or individuals? And Matt, I'm going to have you speak to that if you would.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. Thanks, Erin. For both admissions and releases, our current suggested definition is going to be the event, the admission event or the release event, not by person. When we look at daily population, obviously that's a count of people. I'm wondering
comments too on that. If you have a strong preference on individuals versus events, we were thinking events because we know people often move multiple times through systems. So if you have a strong preference, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and I think maybe to Erin's point, I don't know specifically why it's easier for your system, but I in my experience, it sometimes can be hard to match a person by a unique identifier. That is an issue that we see across systems. And that's also going to be relevant. One of the metrics that we probably won't have time to get to is readmissions. And that's another thing where we are going to be looking at readmission events.
Yeah, and Matt, if that feels like actually there'd be more robust discussion there, I'm happy to jump to readmissions as part of this, because we know that was kind of one of the more challenging categories. Do you want to go there, or do you want to kind of keep rolling with releases?
Oh, and well, before we go, Jay asked a good question. What is an event versus an individual? So I think what we're talking about here is, say you have a given month and the same person is admitted to your prison facility 3 times in that month for whatever reason. If you're counting by the person or by the individual, that would be 1, because that single person was admitted to prison during that month. But if we're talking about events, that would be a count of 3, because that individual person was admitted 3 times.
Great. Well, how
Yeah.
about we show the includes excludes for releases, and then we can kind of see where we want to go next. Maybe we can go back to readmissions. So this again is the recipe list for what might be included in your definition of releases. And again, all of the things you could toggle on or off are in the table, but would not be individual numbers you would be asked to share. So again, when you think of releases from your agency facilities, does this list adequately capture and allow you to define accurately your release structure? And there's a great question in the chat too about releases from incarceration, but maybe not from custody or jurisdiction. And that's definitely something that I think, if that's not in this list clearly, I'd love to hear some suggestions from Chris or others about how we could more clearly capture, that distinction or that actually spectrum for people. All right, we'll call this our last vote for today. So I see a couple of you typing on the critical things that are missing. Please do let us know your suggestions there. But I'm going to turn it back to Sarah for a couple of wrap-up slides. And again, I'll share out the email address so that if folks have additional thoughts, or if you love this conversation and want to get into even more of the weeds with us, we would welcome that. And you're welcome to reach out to us too. All right, Sarah, back to you.
Thanks, Katie. So we hope that what we've been sharing with you today is exciting and inspiring and has encouraged you. I certainly have been getting notifications that people are signing up to be updated on our email list. I assume that's all of you who are in the session and have been following the link we posted in the chat, and that is super exciting. We would really invite you to, if you have not already, visited our website and explored all the things that we have to offer on the project that we haven't had a chance to discuss today. You can find information about what it would mean to become a Justice Count state, how to become more involved in the project. And again, if you sign up for our email list, you'll be notified about the different things that we're going to be doing in the future. We've got a lot that's rolling out over the next several months. I don't even think that we framed the discussion that we're doing today is meant to lead to the development of what we're calling technical implementation guides, which is really going to be like the handbook that an agency uses as they're going through the onboarding process. So if you sign up to the email list, you can be notified when we're rolling those out, and you can see what your discussion and your feedback will have led to, which is super exciting. Let's go to the next slide, Kiosha. And again, we posted the email in the chat, and we really appreciate all the feedback that you have given us. If you feel like you didn't get your question answered, if you have other questions, if you want to learn more and you didn't find the answer on our website, which hopefully it should be there, but if you have other questions that you couldn't find answered on the website, we would really encourage you to send us an email. I'm getting the notifications already that people are signing up again, so it's really exciting. And we thank you all for joining us. I don't know if we have anything else we want to cover, Katie, but this feels like this has been a really productive for us. As you can tell, there's a lot of pieces still moving and that we're still thinking about, and we really, really appreciate you all joining us to think through some of those questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining us. This is a tool and a project for you all. So I'm really, really appreciating that you are all helping us to shape it and make it work for you. And so thanks again for your feedback today and your ongoing participation as we continue to move forward. Enjoy a couple of minutes before your next meeting, and hopefully we'll get to see you all again soon.